Well, thanks, Matthew, and good evening, everyone. Happy Mother's Day to all the mothers out there. Hope you've had a great day, and thanks for coming along and or listening in, as the case may be, or viewing us. Listening in is probably a bit old school these days, isn't it? I wanted to take a look at this topic because it's one of interest to me: the Bible and science. That title is picked very deliberately, with emphasis on the and I'll get to that a little bit later. But I thought, importantly, the first thing that I wanted to do was throw up a little bit of a disclaimer. When people frequently see religious bodies talking about the Bible and science, there might be a bit of groaning, a bit of eye rolling. Here we go. We're going to hear about some theories from gentlemen that run theme parks with Noah's Ark replicas in them, or so forth. And that's not what I'm about tonight. The other thing is too, people can sometimes tend to make a distinction or a lack of distinction between this and perhaps Christian lobby groups that then use that jumping off point to influence politicians. There's been a lot written in the paper or in the media of late around Scott Morrison's religious convictions and how they might be shaping policy and so forth. So I wanted to make one disclaimer, if it's right, just about the Christadelphians in general. And I say in general because it is a general statement. And we don't participate in political life at any level, and I'm really putting this here to dismiss any misconceptions that anyone might have about me or other Christadelphians with whom you come into contact. We are Bible believers, and we are supporters of scientific research and discovery. So, as I said before, of late there's been sort of a bit of an imported fear, I guess, from the US of what commentators call the Christian right, a political lobby group that attempts to force so-called Christian values on the political process. I'm not here to comment about that, about their endeavours. The one comment I will make is that I think they've come to prominence in cases in the US where they've attempted to ensure that intelligent design, or neo-creationism, however you like to call it, is taught in science or school science classes alongside evolutionary theory. And there are those on both sides of the fence that might have very strong views about this and about the influence that this group wields in Australia. It's undoubtedly a force to be reckoned with in the US. All I want to say at this point in time is that Christadelphians are not a part of this lobby group, and this is due to our stance as conscientious objectors. And our firm belief is that God is in control of world affairs and doesn't require our help to move them along. I personally believe, and this is my personal belief, that the Christian right, this lobby group of the Christian right, are a severely misguided, though well-meaning group. And unfortunately for us, that they've done a lot to confuse people as to God's message in the Bible. So, having said that, we are going to explore God's message in the Bible. But what is it? When we take a look at this topic, the first thought that comes to mind is, isn't this a bit of a fiction? The Bible and science. Is it the Bible and science, or the Bible versus science? Because a lot of the debate when we talk about religious beliefs and science, people tend to put a versus in the middle. There's some kind of disparity here. There's something that doesn't mesh. Well, I'm proposing this presentation is about investigating the Bible and science. I think, contrary to popular believed myth, there is actually no conflict between the Bible and science. They don't contradict each other, unless, at least if you take the correct definition of science and the Bible. And importantly, recognising the boundaries that each has. So, having said that, I'm going to be quite bold. Put to you what I believe my definition of science is, what it is, and also what it isn't. And then I'd like to have a look at what the Bible is and what the Bible isn't. So firstly, I'm going to be bold here. And I say I'm going to be bold. I'm not a scientist of any nature. So I haven't studied science in university. I quite enjoyed science in high school. Chemistry was a favourite of mine. Blowing things up was always fun. But I'm not a scientist. By trade, if you want to go back into my dim, dark past, by trade, I'm a computer programmer, which I guess is a kind of a science, really. But it's more linguistics, I guess, and logic than it is actual real science. What is science? Science, as it says on the screen there, reports the facts. People discover facts about things. One of the things I've got here is a quote from a man called Paul Kitcher, which I thought was quite interesting. Science advances our understanding of nature by showing us how to derive descriptions of many phenomena using the same pattern of derivation again and again, and in demonstrating this, it teaches us how to reduce the number of facts we have to accept as ultimates. And I would add to that, maybe God is one of those ultimates. One of the things that we know is that no one can say that they definitively know that God exists. But on the other hand, no one can say that God definitively does not exist. People either believe that God exists or they believe that he doesn't exist. They either believe his word or they don't. And the key word here is believe. There is an element of faith involved. And I know that, perhaps if you're listening and you're of an atheistic persuasion, you might be thinking, well, I don't have faith. I'm a rationalist. I'm a skeptic. I only accept the facts. And that would be quite right. See, contrary to popular belief, faith in the Bible is not a blind faith. I reckon I can show you more solid fact that the Bible is in fact an accurate record of past, present and future than you can show me that it doesn't. But I still wouldn't argue against you choosing not to believe it. We'll get to that in a little while. Choice and free will are the linchpins of the Bible and our part in it, our part in that present and our part in that future that I was talking about. One of the other things I'll note here, and you'll probably hear me say this a little bit, and I'm going to get a little bit technical on this. Science cannot prove or disprove macroevolutionary theory. Now, I want to make a distinction between the two theories. There's microevolutionary theory, otherwise known as adaptation within species, and that is an observed scientific phenomenon. Macroevolutionary theory is species bleeding into other species. And that in itself is not an observed phenomena. It's a derived theory from the observation of adaptation within species. So you might hear me use that term macroevolutionary theory. That's when I'm talking about evolutionary theory. That's what I'm talking about. Is macroevolutionary theory. So what is or isn't the Bible? The Bible is God's word. The Bible is God revealing himself and his plan to us. It's a guide to life, both now and forever. And what it shows us from the past is people who have lived lives that have either been very faithful to God or not been faithful to God. We're given examples of both types of life. Most importantly, it's the basis, as I've got here, it is the basis of faith in God. Believing in the Bible, building faith in God and exploring his word is a choice that we have before us. And it's our choice. God provides us free will to make that choice. And that's why I said before, I wouldn't argue against you choosing not to believe in the Bible. Faith is a very personal thing. And I'm going to share with you my reasons for believing in the Bible tonight. And hopefully you see some merit in those and you will choose to examine them further. But it's a choice. Both sides of that choice have consequences, but I wouldn't deny you your choice. So when we talk about faith, we talk about the Bible being a book of faith, we talk about belief in God or belief in the non-existence of God as faith. What is faith? And I'm going to throw up two definitions. The first is from a man that may be well known to you, a man named Richard Dawkins, very outspoken atheist. He's written several polemic pieces as to the dangers of religion. that, my personal opinion is, I think they're quite ill-considered pieces, and perhaps, and I'll go into detail as to why that is later on. And I'll throw up a biblical version or a biblical definition, a definition from the Bible of what faith is, just to understand the differences between the two. Because we often hear when people talk about religious faith as it being a blind faith. And certainly that's what Richard Dawkins would define as religious faith. It's a state of mind that leads people to believe something, it doesn't matter what, in the total absence of supporting evidence. Is a quote from his book, The Selfish Genes, one of his more famous works. I think that's a deeply flawed personal definition of faith that leads to all sorts of deeply flawed assertions as opposed to logical, factual arguments. God doesn't expect us to have blind faith as defined by Richard Dawkins. That's why he supplies us a book with a number of proofs in it, and we've had one of those proofs read to us tonight. It may not have sounded like it, but what you have there in Ezekiel chapter 26 is a prophecy that took 1,700 years to come to pass. And it came to pass exactly as it was written down in Ezekiel 26, but more on that later. Paul talks about faith in Hebrews 11 verse 1 is this: faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. So there's two things that come out of that quote. First of all, it has substance, and faith is based on evidence. This is what God would have us to believe about a biblical faith. Now, that is not the kind of thing that require blind faith, as is proposed by Mr. Dawkins here. How I actually picked up one of his works that came out called The God Delusion, because I thought it's always good to read the other side, always good to understand where people are coming from. So I read his book. And one of the interesting things that he starts off in the book is he says that he stopped reading the Bible at the age of 9. So it's little wonder then that he thinks that his statement here is a nice, sturdy definition from which he can take pot shots at those who profess to have some sort of religious faith. Before we move on, I thought it's worth quoting Dawkins just one more time. In true polemic style, he went after a theologian called Mary Midgley, who called into question one of his theories. In response to her criticism, this is what he wrote: Midgley seems not to understand biology or the way biologists use language. No doubt my ignorance would be just as obvious if I rushed headlong into her field of expertise, but I would then adopt a more diffident tone. As it is, we are both in my corner, and it is hard for me not to regard the gloves are off. There was a molecular biologist and theologian, a man named Alistair McGrath, who later wrote this about that statement. He said, "Yet is this the same Richard Dawkins who, knowing nothing about Christian theology, rushes headlong into the field and tells theologians what they really mean when they use their own language, or that they really mean blind trust when they speak of faith? There is a total failure on Dawkins' part to even begin to understand Christian theology, or what it means by its own language. It really does make it difficult to take his judgments concerning its alleged failures with any degree of seriousness." And it's interesting that both of those sets of comments, those two quotes that I just read, were made before Dawkins published The God Delusion, which I think actually makes it a rather embarrassing book to have published. However, somewhat disappointingly, I guess personally disappointingly, you can still find that book today in the science sections of most bookshops. I actually think it's quite embarrassing for him to have written a book like that, given some of the comment that's made about his views. And if we're to be even-minded about it, I think when we look at those views, to be even-minded about it, it is probably a stretch for him to have written a book about religion. Well, why is there this tussle? And Dawkins, I think, is probably just one example of that. Why is there this tussle between religion and science? Why is there a war between the two? Well, there's a couple of things. There's a couple of stories, a couple of myths that probably need to be busted about religion versus science, or science versus religion. The first one, I think, is probably, you may or may not know this story about Galileo versus the Pope. The history of Galileo battling the Roman Catholic Church and the pontiff is suggested as the point where science and the Bible were brought into stark contrast. And I say suggested as it's only been understood as such in the last 160 to 165 years, even though it took place in the early 17th century, almost 400 years ago. If you don't know the story, I'll fill you in. Galileo was a proponent of the theory of heliocentrism. In other words, the solar system and all the planets in it revolve around the sun. Previously, people thought that everything revolved around the Earth because it was the centre of the universe, and it was popularly believed at the time. Now, the Roman Catholic Church took a very dim view of this theory, chiefly because it would make them look a little bit silly as they come out in support of the opposite theory, that all the universe revolved around the Earth. And it was based on a couple of very dodgy interpretations of a couple of psalms. Prior to this, Galileo had got into a slinging match with a Jesuit priest on the trajectory of a particular comet. And it was a long and protracted fight that ended with Galileo's publication of a book called the Essay, which began with a string of insults aimed at this particular Jesuit. In the end, it turned out they were actually both wrong, but the damage was done, and the Jesuits turned out to not like Galileo very much. So the next thing he comes out with is his heliocentrism theory, that the solar system revolved around the sun, and he found that he had a fair bit of opposition from the Roman Catholic Church, not surprisingly. The Pope, however, was actually very interested in this theory, and he asked him to come and explain his reasons for supporting his theory on the strength, and on the strength of this, write a publication. So he sat down with him, he talked with him, he said, look, this is very interesting, can you publish something for us to have a read? And Galileo did so, but he did so using a fictional debate as a device for demonstrating this theory. Unfortunately, he gave the loser of this debate some of the exact wording that the Pope had used, and he also painted the loser of the debate a bit of a dimwit. So Galileo now had zero sympathy from anyone that even smelt like a Roman Catholic. And from here, things only got worse. And after a transition, he finished up in permanent house arrest. However, an examination of the whole affair had more to do with the toes that he trod on rather than his science. It was a political rather than scientific fight. Certainly it didn't shake his faith in God at all. He died as a devout Roman Catholic. And neither did it shake any of the supporters of heliocentrism, which obviously today we know to be true. The Earth and all the other planets revolve around the sun. It was an observable scientific fact. So how then did this become a mainstay in the claim that belief in the Bible and scientific curiosity were mutually exclusive things? If you believe in the Bible, you must not want to hear anything about any kind of scientific discovery. You're finished with awe in the organic world and how it operates. You've closed your mind and you're just going to read the Bible and it's going to tell you what's what. We'll really have to start in the 18th century, in 18th century England, where there'd been a remarkable synergy between science and religion up until around about the 18th century or 19th century, with such figures as Isaac Newton, who had Newton's laws and all the rest of them. It's a long time ago when I studied those, so I'm not going to try and explain those. But he was also deeply interested in prophecy and wrote some extremely interesting some books and articles on prophecy in the Bible. And when we look at it, at that point in time, the scientific parson was a well-established stereotype. Not only did they study the Bible, they were also, a lot of them were fairly keen naturalists and would go out and discover things about the world. This then brings us to late 19th century England. Two works have been identified in that era as the catalyst of the Bible versus science conflict. One was called The History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, rather aptly named if you want to have a straw man argument, by a guy called John William Draper. And the second one was The Warfare of Science with Theology Within Christendom, published by a man named Andrew Dixon. And both writers, it appears, had axes to grind with specific members of the clergy and particular church institutions. And both of them used the Galileo incident as evidence that religion was opposed to scientific advancement. And unfortunately, this was backed up by some of the clergy's reaction to the rise of the professional scientists. They saw it as a bit of a threat. And this then sort of sharpened, pitchforks on either side. People started lighting torches and looking for witches. But again, this model of conflict was only pertinent to the social pressures and conflicts of Victorian England. And in reality, it was all to do with politics between two competing groups rather than the continuance, as was pictured, of a science versus religion war. Now, given that this is an outdated, not to mention wrong perception, is atheism based on macroevolutionary theory science? Can it thus be claimed that science and the Bible are in conflict? Well, certainly, macroevolutionary theory has a scientific base. The conclusions inferred by its adherents are derived from science. But no one would deny that there are inferences that have no conclusive proof. I could say that science fiction is also derived from science. But no one would argue that the popular fictional writings of Arthur C. Clarke, C.S. Lewis, Robert A. Heinlein or Isaac Asimov are scientific fact because they are based on science. Interestingly, Arthur C. Clarke and C.S. Lewis, their works of science fiction are quite interesting when compared to each other. They actually wrote competitively. C.S. Lewis, being a Christian, had one idea of what would happen if people colonised space. He said that we would ruin everything like we've ruined the earth. Arthur C. Clarke, not as religious, had a lot of hope in mankind and said, "Oh no, we'll magically reinvent ourselves and be better people." Interesting when you compare the two works. Quite aside from this, would proving macroevolutionary theory disprove the existence of God? Would it be the silver bullet? If I could lay down facts today that showed you that macroevolutionary theory is true, would that knock out the existence of God? Well, actually, it wouldn't. Perhaps all it would do, and I say perhaps because at this point there is no proof, it would disprove a literal six-day creation. But it would still leave the probability that God existed. It still wouldn't counter some of the facts that we have, some of the evidence, some of the substance that we have in the Bible that God exists and that he has a plan for this earth. So what then do we have? I had actually originally titled this presentation Macroevolutionary Theory versus the Bible, but it's a bit long. But this would be to miss the real conflict. What are we actually talking about then if we're not talking about the Bible versus science? So really we're talking about two systems of faith colliding. This is your real conflict. Atheism versus the Bible. Because we're talking about atheism rather than science when we talk about the Bible versus science. No, atheism versus the Bible, sorry. I'll say that again. We're talking about atheism versus the Bible rather than science versus the Bible when we get into these kinds of discussions. The argument then is between those who believe in God and those who do not believe in God, and then attempt to give their arguments for doing so a pattern of rationality and intellectual rigour by attempting to drag science into their corner. Again, if I was to reference Richard Dawkins railing against religion, strangely, he only has a shot against Christianity when he talks about religion, but we'll leave that for another night. But at least practicing Christians are honest about their faith. It's a rational faith, but it's a faith nevertheless. Unfortunately, Dawkins and friends will hide their faith behind words like rational, logical, and evidence when their position as far as scientific proof is as untenable, in fact, more so, I would say, than practicing Christians. So I want to get on to the topic tonight that we had read to us today. Why did I have Ezekiel 26 read to us tonight? We've got a slide here around why I choose to believe in the Bible. And again, I use that word choice. It is a choice, and it's a choice that I weighed up before I became a Christadelphian. Now, we read Ezekiel chapter 26 because it's a prophecy. Prophecy makes up 25% of the Bible, and this prophecy is one that was fulfilled. Now, if you say, oh, great, Tim, you found one prophecy, good on you. What about the rest of them? Well, I can keep listing them, but I think what we'll do is we'll stick with Ezekiel chapter 26 because it's quite a compelling prophecy and it's quite a simple one to map to history. There are others that we could look at. The book of Nahum, the destruction of talking about the destruction of the Assyrians and their stronghold Nineveh. Jeremiah 51 talks about the destruction of Babylon. Ezekiel 37 talks about the restoration of the Jewish people to the nation of Israel. Luke 21 talks about the restoration of Jerusalem to the Jewish people, which happened sometime after they were restored to the land itself. And I could keep going. Nahum is an interesting book. For many years, in the late 19th century, it was used by a group called the Higher Critics to disprove the Bible. No one, at the time, archaeology was all the rage. People were sticking on pith hats and running out into the desert with a trowel to dig up things. And no one at that point, despite all the holes that had been dug in the Middle East, had found Nineveh. So it appeared to be a fictional city, and this appeared to be a fictional prophecy, something the same as sort of Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Xanadu poem. And then it was uncovered. They found it in the desert, and it was found to have been destroyed in the exact manner laid out in Nahum's prophecy. He talked about water rising and destroying the city wall. They found that the city wall had been actually undermined and destroyed by a flood as much as the siege engines of the invading army. But that's something else. we'll get onto that. I'll keep talking if I don't keep an eye on the time. It fascinates me, this stuff. One of the other things that we look at is the human race and its psyche. And we'll get onto that in a second. What I want to do is jump straight into Ezekiel chapter 26, the prophecy we had read for us tonight. And I've put together a bit of a handy table, 2 slides worth of table. So bear with me. This is part 1 of 2. For those of you who don't know, Tyre was one of the great cities of the ancient world. It became immensely wealthy from its purple. The conches around the city in the sea around the city yielded a dye that was abundant there, and the Tyre dyers kept the secrets of that extraction to themselves. No one actually knew how to do this. Now, imperial purple was worth more than its weight in gold, especially during the Roman Empire, and so they became very wealthy on the trade of this dye that they managed to extract from these shells. Tyre consisted of 2 parts, a rocky fortress on the mainland called Old Tyre, and the city built on a small rocky island about half a mile from the shore. And it was a place of great strength. People had come up against it before. You needed a navy and you needed siege engines on your ships to actually try and do some damage. And by the time you got within range, they could sink your ships. So it was quite a protected city as well as a wealthy one. Nevertheless, Ezekiel was told by God to foretell its destruction. Now, bear in mind the prophecy that was given was given in 590 BC. The first chronological portion of that prophecy began 4 years later in 586, and the last detail was completed in 1291 AD. So as I said earlier, we've got 1,700 years of prophecy here. Now, if I was to ask you what you're going to be doing at the end of next week, this time next week, you might have a fairly good idea. If I said to you, well, what would you be doing in 4 years' time? A little less accurate. If I asked what you were going to be doing in 1,700 years' time, yeah, you might have a bit of a laugh at me because you might not think you'll be alive. However, that might not be true, but it all depends on your choice again. So we've got here some of the predictions. So in verses 7 to 8 that we read, we are told that Nebuchadnezzar would come up against the city and destroy the mainland portion of Tyre. This is in 590 BC. 4 years before this came to pass. 4 years later, 580, that should be around the other way, 586 to 585 BC, this happened. Nebuchadnezzar came up against the mainland city and destroyed it. And it's interesting what they said there. He will slay with a sword your daughter villages in the fields. He will heap up a siege mound against you, build a wall against you, and raise a defence against you. So there's some really strong language here. And as if you know your history, the Babylonians weren't nice people. When it came to sieges, if you sort of opposed them in a siege and didn't surrender your city immediately, they would do everything in their power to make sure that city disappeared from existence as a lesson to other people around you, in the hopes that they would surrender rather more quickly than what you did. Other nations are to participate in the fulfilment of this prophecy. Verse 3, therefore, thus says the Lord God, behold, I'm against you, O Tyre, and will cause many nations to come up against you as the sea causes its waves to come up. So the Babylonians had the first shot, 586, 538 to 332 BC. The Persians had a shot. Alexander the Great turned up in 332 BC and finished the job. And after that, we've got a number of people, the Ptolemies, the Seleucids, the Romans, the Muslim Arabs, and a group of mercenaries called Mamelukes who fought alongside them, eventually with the last of those waves to come up. And as you can see, it is very descriptive in the way it says that these people will come up against you like waves. So they'll just keep coming. It's not going to go away. You're not going to live in peace forever. There will be periods of peace, but all through this period, you'll have people coming up to destroy you. One of the interesting things is when Alexander came against it, it talks about the city being flattened like the top of a rock. And what happened was after the mainland city was destroyed, they had to find a way to get to the other city, the one out in the sea. And what Alexander did was he built a causeway. And he built the causeway out of all the rubble of the destroyed city. He took every single block of stone that he could from that city, every single timber, any debris that was left of that city, he scraped it clean as a rock and threw the whole lot into the sea. And basically built a causeway out to the gates of Tyre, out to that island city. And that's how he managed to besiege the city. Again, it's to become a place for the spreading of nets. He scraped it that clean that fishermen later came along and used it as a place to dry their nets. Its stones and timbers are to be laid into the sea. Other cities are to fear greatly at the fall of Tyre. Many other cities in the region, as I said, surrendered to Alexander after the fall of Tyre. If you see the greatest and strongest city in your area get destroyed by somebody, you're probably likely to think about negotiations rather than standing up against somebody who had the means to build a causeway like he did. And the city will not be inhabited or rebuilt. So there was a Crusader fortress that was built, and after the Mamelukes destroyed that Crusader fortress, nothing was rebuilt on that site ever again. There's a small village a little bit down the road from it now that they sort of claim is ancient Tyre, but it's actually not on the exact spot. Nothing was rebuilt on that spot ever again. So when we take a look at this prophecy, and this is just one of many, as I say, these are some of the things that Paul is talking about when he says that there is substance to our faith. There is evidence that God is as good as his word. Here's a prophecy in Ezekiel chapter 26 that we've ripped through very, very quickly. But it's a prophecy that was given in 590 BC and was finally, the last word, the last full stop on that prophecy was delivered in 1291 AD. Not a word out of place in that prophecy. Nothing that was predicted there, I'll go on the positive statement. Everything that was predicted there happened as God said it would. And this isn't the only prophecy that we've got here. So we've got that proof of prophecy. And this, for me, is in conversation. I've had several conversations with people of different faiths, people that don't believe, atheists. And this, to me, is one of the strongest indicators that the Bible is God's word. There's also the human race and its unique psyche. And there's a scientist of a Christian persuasion, a man called Sir John Templeton, and there's actually I believe, a science prize named after him, a coveted science prize called the Templeton Prize. And he's quoted as saying, would it not be strange if a universe without purpose accidentally created humans who are so obsessed with purpose? People look for the meaning of life. Why is it that we care about morality and ethics? If we are accidental creations and we're here just to live life to the fullest and then die with nothing after it, why is it that we are intrigued by the meaning of life? Why is it that if you look at the sort of the self-help section of bookshops, they say these days is the most populated. A lot of these things are about finding meaning in your life. Why is it that we're so obsessed with it? And the other one is when we look at our world as an awesome whole. And I must admit, I'm a little bit addicted to David Attenborough documentaries. I love the cinematography, but I also love the things that he captures. And when you look at those things, when I look at our planet and the universe, I'm filled with awe at the precision of it all. And I simply can't believe, and this is me speaking, not anyone else, but I simply can't believe in the suggestion that it all just happened by random chance. And given the alternative, backed by fulfilled prophecy and amazingly accurate insight into the way we work, I choose the Bible and I choose to believe in God. And again, we could go into a lot more on this, but this is really here just to make you think. Because all I'd ask, and really all God asks, is that we approach this subject. We approach this subject of the Bible with an open mind. Because ultimately, as that slide says there, ultimately the choice is yours. You'll read in the Bible that we're provided free will by God to choose or not. But he does put in front of us compelling evidence and substance for us to make that choice. And he hopes that we choose him, that we choose his word and we choose to follow his word. So when it comes down to it, there really is no argument between the Bible and science. But there is a choice to be made around where we choose to put our faith. And again, if you're to approach this subject again with an open mind and to look at the Bible, you'll understand not only is it a choice of how we choose to live life today, but there's also a fantastic message of hope for the future. The Bible answers those questions around the meaning of life, the purpose of life. It answers the question of how we came to be and why it is that we're obsessed with purpose and morality and ethics. And it provides us an idea of those morality and ethics. It provides us a guide today, but it also tells us why we're asked to live like we live today. Because there is a future coming where we will see all of this writ large and a better world. So again, the choice is yours to make. All I'd ask and all God asks is that we approach this subject with an open mind. Thanks.